The federal government has reached an agreement in principle that resolves a national class action lawsuit over the lack of safe drinking water in First Nations communities. The agreement includes a commitment of at least $6 billion to support reliable access to safe drinking water on reserves. And it provides a $1.5 billion in compensation for those who have been deprived of clean drinking water.
We have suffered so much. We have lost so much. We have endured so much.
Children do not even swim in our water anymore. And we are all aware that in all First Nations that water is life, and we consider it very sacred.
Indigenous Services Minister Marc Miller is in Bella Bella, BC. Thank you for joining us today, Minister. I want to start by asking you about something that was said at today's news conference. Chief Wayne Munius asked, why did this issue even have to go to the courts? Why did it require all of this struggle to get to a solution?
Yeah, and it's an important question to reflect on our relationship with Indigenous peoples, Katie. I think what's important to reflect upon today is the fact that we avoided a court situation. We never preclude communities from exercising their legal remedies. But when they decided to go to court for this, to get reparations for past harm, and there's a component in today's announcement that deals with the harm occurred for, in some cases, over a quarter of a century, there was also the insistence on making sure there were real, tangible commitments with teeth for the future. And that dual-pronged approach and the insistence on making sure that the government of Canada could be held to account is a testament to the lack of trust that has characterized our relationship, where Canada has not respected its obligations. This is a government that has put safe and clean drinking water on the map for Indigenous communities, for Canadians to realize that we need to do better. And the announcement today that reflects all in about $8 billion of compensation and forward commitments is something that we need to do as a country to make sure that everyone has access to safe, clean drinking water, which hasn't been the case with a number of these communities. So it is the chief's words actually speak for themselves and are reflective of how we need to move in the way forward, which is a respectful, cooperative relationship outside the court. And I recognize that perhaps a different government wouldn't have done this and would be in court despite arguing some particularities of law that are completely unnecessary, because we're all on the same page in getting clean water into communities.
But would the government have even done this if it had not been for the threat of this massive class action lawsuit?
Well, we've made significant commitments to Indigenous communities, particularly in the critical infrastructure and water, making sure that people have clean, safe water. Those commitments have resulted in the lifting of 108 advisories. Those communities haven't had to go to court, but there was an issue in and around trust and in and around reparations for past harm, and in and around commitments for the future. So there's about 200 plus communities that will be beneficiary of this, depending on the uptake in the class size, which we'll leave up to the lawyers. But it also is a testament to the fact of where we are as a country, where communities can exercise their legal rights. The class action mechanism exists for communities that feel they have suffered similar harm. And we were more than glad to sit down with them and discuss in a cooperative way how we move forward outside the courtroom process and not in that adversarial fashion that really gets nothing done. This will get something done, and we'll make sure, most importantly, that the next generation will not grow up without clean drinking water.
Okay, so you say that you don't want this to be an adversarial relationship, and we heard you say that at a news conference that you don't want to be in the courts, but there are other issues, other legal battles that you're engaging in right now. Take a look at Jordan's principle. So are you going to take a new approach when it comes to fighting these issues in the courts dealing with Indigenous communities?
Well, we've actually done so. And when communities decide that we are not living up to expectations, there is sometimes a process that involves courtrooms. We don't want to be in a position to block that process. And when that happens, we sit down. Take, for example, the very well publicized court cases in and around both Jordan's principle and the harm suffered by children that were taken into the broken healthcare system. We've been sitting down for the last year or so, trying to hash out the terms of how to settle this in a good way, and we've made progress. We've put billions and billions of dollars into moving towards substantive equality with vis-a-vis Indigenous children and non-Indigenous children.
But this is
we'll continue to do so.
I don't mean to interrupt, Minister, but this is still in the courts.
No, it's fine.
The government is still trying to overturn the Canada Human Rights Tribunal decision. That legal battle is still going on.
Yes, and recognize that there are three moving parts to this, including two other class actions where we are sitting down with council trying to hash out a settlement and how we would move forward in ensuring that that the children are properly compensated. That is ongoing, but it's also something out of respect that we don't discuss in the public sphere, as frustrating as that may be to all Canadians. We need to respect the process. We're going to work at this just as hard, if not more, than the way we worked at getting to this process and endpoint. But that is something that that I will do with my team, with the legal teams of both the Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society and others as we move forward on many moving parts that do have some complexities to them, including the jurisdiction of the CHRT, which I understand people find frustrating that we object to, but there is a general court process that that has three parties with the same claims and competing processes that we have to all piece together. So that is what it is. We'll compose with it and make sure that children aren't harmed in the process and get that compensation that they are due.
So you're not going to change tact, even though, you know, today you're talking about how you don't want to be in the courts. There's no change in strategy here?
Well, the tact, Katie, is that we are sitting down with those parties and working in a positive way, but we have undertaken to them some confidentiality that we will not discuss in the public domain. Those talks are ongoing. They are productive, but it's something that I can't speak further to. Our objective and my objective to my team is that we will continue to ensure that First Nations children that were harmed by the broken healthcare system in Canada, child welfare system in Canada, are compensated. But no decision of a court can fix that system definitively. We have to move towards transforming that system to one that is focused on prevention as opposed to intervention, which has characterized it up to now and prejudiced Indigenous children. That's why we enacted C-92 child welfare legislation that allows communities to assert their own self-determination and lift up their child and family laws. That's why the Prime Minister was in Cowessess to sign a historic agreement. We'll keep moving on with those agreements. But I do recognize that that is a slow process, and a slow process specifically because we don't want children to fall through the cracks. And that is where we are as a country. We need to compensate those children, but we also have to transform the system so that this model does not reproduce itself.
Late last year, your government announced it would miss its target to lift all long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations by March 2021. Where does that project stand right now in terms of progress?
Well, as you heard today, this is an undertaking that goes well beyond the undertaking that was made in 2015, as ambitious as it was. We do recognize that there are a number of communities that still have outstanding long-term water projects, but they do have work underway, and it has slowed with COVID. Communities have shut down. I've spoken to them myself, but there is hope there because we have some good news coming out in the next couple of months. There are communities just ready to do the testing and have clean water, just waiting for those to come back. But we have to make additional investments, and that's why this announcement today was so important. The chief of Curve Lake, for example, is not on a long-term drinking water advisory, but wants long-term commitments with respect to getting water to all her community members. That will take millions and millions of dollars of capital investments. That would not necessarily have fallen under the strict confines of the LTWA lift commitment of the Prime Minister in 2015. But we know that we need to do more to get real projects into communities. One of the other communities, Chippewas of the Nawash, wanted and got another $35 million for a plant that will serve its people better. And that's what we got to recognize. It isn't a final date of March 2021. It's an ongoing commitment that has to survive government changes and has to reflect the commitment that is needed today. It's why there's legal teeth to this agreement today, which will span over years.
I remember the 2015 election campaign, and a huge promise, the promise, the clean drinking water promise, was a massive part of Justin Trudeau's campaign back in 2015. Your government has been in power since then. Why should people in these communities believe that you're going to reach these targets when you missed your first deadline?
Well, each community has a plan in place to lift their long-term water advisory. Recall that there were 105 in place when we got into power. We've lifted 108. There's more to do. There's been some slippage. We've lifted short-term water advisories to the tune of 186, which when they lapse a year become long-term water advisories. But what we heard loud and clear from communities that still have long-term water advisories and those advocating on behalf of other communities have told us that there has to be long-term commitments with respect to, yes, capital investments, yes, expansion of water and wastewater system, but also the training of local operators. And we're not there yet in a certain sense and haven't made that financial commitment to break through an old model that only compensated those operators in an unfair way. We've done that. We did that last year, and now we're making a doubling of the $4 billion that we've already put into this to another $8 billion that'll ensure that communities have what they should have gotten in the first place, which is clean drinking water, as well as undertake to repair past harms that have been made by prior governments, which is why today's announcement is so important.
Last thing I want to ask you really quickly, we've got about a minute left. Grand Chief Jerry Daniels is calling for police to investigate residential schools and make those criminal investigations public, whether or not charges are laid, as we saw with the case with the Fort Alexander Residential School in Manitoba. We heard that announcement from the RCMP this week. Should that be a blanket policy?
You know, I've probably visited a half dozen sites over the last 2 weeks and met with leadership as to the process that they would like to undertake with respect to the lost souls or the communities that had their children ripped from them. And they're making these horrific discoveries that reflect the truths that were known and that we denied. Each community has its particular views on the process, and we need to let them take the lead in what they want to see. Clearly, there's more need for the truth and openness and transparency, whether that's in police investigation or others. There is also a need for closure, and whether that includes the prosecution once they find sufficient evidence to go forward. I'm wholly supportive of it, but that is obviously in a pluralistic democracy such as ours, an independent process of the police that needs to remain independent for the integrity of the process. But I'd like to see people held to account. We've seen in many trials where there have been investigations that they have at times been fruitless, and that is very frustrating and foremost re-traumatizing for community members. So we're being very, very cautious in how we approach this, but ensuring that communities have the resources necessary, financial and mental health or otherwise, to move forward on the particular path that they choose at their time. And inevitably that includes at times prosecution, but that isn't at times the only solution to this process. And I get that is complex, but it has to be trauma informed, with the survivors and those suffering intergenerational trauma at foremost at the top of people's minds.
Minister, I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Katie.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.